Boker Tov. Today's daf yomi is Nedarim daf Lamed Dalet Nedarim 34. We're going to start 10 lines from the bottom on Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis and 33b. The Gemara said that even if you've taken an oath that Reuven and Shimon are Mudar Hana, that he's not allowed to, let's say Shimon is not allowed to give benefit to Reuven. Nevertheless, he could return a lost object. Gemara is going to bring us into a dispute which is actually counterintuitive. So what we're talking about here is Pligi by Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi. Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi have an argument. We don't know who says what, but Chad Amar, one of them is of the position that when we say that even though you're Mudar Hana from someone, you could return the lost object. This is the case only when the nichse of the machzir, when the person who's returning the object, in this case Shimon, let's say, is returning the object to Reuven, that's asurin, that's prohibited on the Baal Aveda. That's Reuven, who Reuven lost the lost object. So that's when we say that you're allowed to return it. That's why Shimon, even though Shimon is not allowed to give benefit to Reuven, if Reuven is the one who lost the lost object, Shimon's allowed to return it to him. And the reason is the Chimahadar way, because when he was returned to him, Miyadam Dinavshe Kamahadar way. Shimon's not really benefiting Reuven. All he's doing is returning to Reuven the object that was really Reuven's in the first place. So therefore, it's going to be okay. So therefore, that's when our Mishnah says that you're allowed to return the lost object, when it was really his objects in the first place. However, but let's say it was a case of Reuven who lost the lost object. Let's say his objects were prohibited on Shimon, then Asurin al Machzir, Asurin. Then we're going to say, but if the objects of Reuven are prohibited upon Shimon, then Shimon's not allowed to return it. Why? To Kamahaniwe Pruta de Rav Yosef, because under these cases, he's benefiting him. The Shimon, by returning the lost object, is benefiting from what's called the Pruta of Rav Yosef. Pruta of Rav Yosef is a concept that we have several times in Shas, and it deals with the case of, we have it in Baba Kama, we have it in Baba Metzia, we have it in Shvuos. We're talking about a person who's a shomer, and he's watching a lost object. Then Rav Yosef says he's going to be considered like a shomer sachar, like a hired worker, and the reason is because he's saving money by watching the lost object. Because if a poor person would show up at his door and ask for money while he's involved in watching the lost object, then he wouldn't have to give the poor person money. So therefore, he's saving money. And so therefore, in this case as well, we're going to say that if Reuven is the one who lost the object and Shimon's not allowed to benefit from Reuven, then we're going to say under this case, according to one of these positions of either Rabbi Ami or Rabbi Asi, Shimon would not be allowed to return the lost object because he's benefiting from the proof of Rav Yosef, because while he's involved with the lost object, if a person knocks on his door and asks for money, he's exempt because he's osik b'mitzvah. He's involved in a mitzvah actively at that moment, and so therefore he's going to be exempt from the mitzvah. We're on Lamed Gimel on the base, 2 lines from the bottom, on Lamed Gimel on the base, 33b. So whereas the other one, it says, even if the Baal Aveda's possessions, let's say Reuven's possessions, are prohibited on Shimon, Shimon would still be allowed to return it. Mishum Pruta de Rav Yosef or Shliach, because this case of the Pruta de Rav Yosef is very uncommon. It's not a common thing that when you're involved in the mitzvah, somebody's going to knock on your door and ask for money. And so therefore, Shimon will be allowed to return the lost object. So So that's the dispute between Rav Ami and Rav Asi. One is of the position that our case, when our Mishnah says you can be machzir aveda, so it refers only to a case of where Shimon is returning the lost object to Ruvain. But and Shimon is not allowed to benefit Ruvain. But in a case where Ruvain in a case where Shimon is not allowed to get benefit from Ruvain, one is going to be at a position that he wouldn't be allowed to return that case because of the proof of the Rav Yosef. Whereas the other one of Rav Meir Vasi says no, in both cases he's allowed to return the object because the case of the proof of the Rav Yosef is shliach. In the first case, Ruvain isn't benefiting anything because it's his lost object to begin with. So now we're on the top of Amud Aleph. The Mishnah says, Tanan, Makom Shenotlin Alehan Star. We say in our Mishnah, it says at the end of our Mishnah, we want to know what's the scenario of what our Mishnah is referring to. So our Mishnah says, Makom Shenotlin Alehan Star, in a case where you take sachar, you take payment, you take money for returning the lost objects, Tipo Hana, then you don't get that, you don't give the hana goes to hektish. You basically he doesn't give him the money, you give the money to hektish. The Mefarish explains because to keep in the mudarim menu hana, because he says he's not allowed to get benefit from him, then he's not allowed to give him payment for the money for the job that he did. So the Gemara says, Bishal Amanda Amar makes sense according to the approach. Remember the dispute between Rav and Rasi. Bishal Amanda Amar Afil B'Shenich Ba'aveda Asur Mamachzir. It makes sense even according to the one who says that we're even talking about a scenario where the Nichse Ba'aveda, the possessions in this case of Ruvain, who's the one who lost the objects, are prohibited on the Machzir, they're prohibited on Shimon. It makes sense that even and according to this approach, you're allowed to return it. Naming Mahadar, according to the second approach, that's Hainu Dikatani. This is why it states Malcolm Shenotono Anschar, Tipo no Akdish. That's why since Shimon is allowed to return the object to Ruvain, because we're saying the Pruta de Rav Yosef is not common. So therefore, Reuven should have to pay Shimon, but Shimon's not allowed to benefit. So therefore, under that scenario, Reuven has to give the money to Hektish. Fine, that makes sense. But according to the first approach of the Pligi Rabbi Amir Ravasi, when Reuven's objects, Reuven's the Baal Aveda, he's the owner of the lost object, and his possessions are prohibited on Shimon. And under that scenario, Lo Mahader, then Shimon's not allowed to return it because of the Pruta de Rav Yosef. Well, if that's the case, Amai Tipo Hanala Hektish, then why will the Hana go to Hektish? What are we talking about? Shimon's not allowed to return it to Reuven in that case. So what case are we talking about? What case could we be talking about? Could we be talking about a case where Reuven is not allowed to get money from Shimon? Well, if that's the case, how is that possible? So then Reuven, if he gets the object from Shimon, he should be allowed to pay him. Why wouldn't Reuven be allowed to give money to Shimon? So the answer of the Gemara is Achada Katani. No, it's talking about one. Meaning to say, this out we'll read the Rash, al derech echad, meaning to say we're talking about one specific scenario. The Ukimta of our Mishnah is talking about one specific scenario. Kagon im ein hamachzir road selakabasar. We're talking about a case where Shimon does not want to receive payment for returning the lost object. Ubal aveda, and the owner of the lost object, eino yachol akfo, and the owner of the lost object is not able. He can't keep the money with him because then he's benefiting from Shimon. Hilkoch tipo hana hektish. Therefore, under that scenario, the hana is default hektish. So we're talking about a very specific scenario where the machzir doesn't want to return the money, and Reuven is not allowed to benefit from Shimon. So therefore, he has to give the hana to hektish. Tosfos says here, Pirish legabe chada minayo katani tipo ano hektish. we're talking about one of the scenarios. Lagabi Bala Veda. We're talking about the owner of the lost object. She'im hamachzir eino rotza lekabel asrar. That if the one who's returning the object doesn't want to collect the money, but Ruvain is not allowed to get benefit from Shimon. So therefore, our Mishnah is teaching us that Ruvain, who's the Baal Veda, has to give Shimon the money. So, and if you want to say, well, why doesn't the Mishnah tell us a scenario where the case where the machzir doesn't want to collect the money? That's that. So this says that's the normal case. The person who's returning the lost object, he doesn't want to take money. Well, the mitzvah, most people find the lost object, they return to you, say, oh, let me pay you. Most people say, no, I don't want to take money. It's a mitzvah. And so it's given you bottom in Malachto. So the Yesham also Sheno Choshesh Lakabel Schar hold a mitzvah. He's allowed to take money, but Orcha the Milsa. That's why the Gemara is talking about this scenario. Now we have a whole version of the Girsa of this Gemara from the Ran, but we're just going to use the printed page and not the Ran's Girsa. But if you want to know, the Ran is a slightly different version of the Gemara than Tzarech Ayin Sham. So the Gemara says, we continue the Gemara, Ika Damasnila Bahai Lishna, that some have a different lashon of this dispute between Rav Ami and Rav Asi. Ika Damasni Bahai Lishna. Some have a different dispute, a different version of this discussion. According to this version of the discussion, According to this version of the discussion, Rabbi Ami and Rav Asi are cholek, they argue. Chad Amar, one says, oh, well, Shanu, when do we say you can return the lost object? Only in a scenario where the Baal Aveda, the owner of the lost object, i.e. Ruvain, where his objects are prohibited on Shimon. And so there, Shimon will be allowed to return him. We're not concerned about the Pruta de Rav Yosef. It's not common. But where Shimon is not allowed to give benefit to Ruvain because Shimon is the one who found the lost object and he's not allowed to give benefit to Ruvain. Under those scenarios, lo mahader, according to this second version, he's not allowed to return it. Why? Mishum de Kamahani way, because even though it's Ruvain's object, he's still benefiting from him. Mishum de Kamahani way. And the Ran says, this is a greater case, this is more benefit than just paying his debt. The Hakamamati way biyade, because he's actually placing it into his hands. And if he's not going to return the lost object, it's possible he's going to lose it. So the Gemara says, so back to the Mishnah. So one is of the position that he's not, that if it's the Machzer, he can't return it because he's benefiting the Baal Aveda. One says, no, even where the Nichse, the Machzer, i.e. Shimon, who found the lost object, even where he's not allowed to benefit the Baal Aveda, i.e. Ruvain, Mutter, would still be permitted to return it, because what all he's doing is returning the object that really belongs to Ruvain in the first place. So Gemara wants to prove who's correct here. Tanan, according to this lashon, what do we say? Makom shenoton allow star, and in a place where you take payment for returning a lost object, tipo anoa hektish, you're allowed to, the anoa has to go to the temple. Now, it makes sense according to the one that who says that even where the lost objects of the Machzir are prohibited on the Baal Aveda, it makes sense according to even in a situation where the Nechse of the Machzir are prohibited on the Baal Aveda, where Shimon's objects are prohibited on Ruvain, then under that scenario, you would still be allowed to return it because we're saying that that's not considered Hana. Well, that's why we could have a scenario. Hainu demitarates Malcolm. That's why you have a scenario where you need to explain why you can't give him the money, because Reuven owes Shimon the money, and so therefore you have to say you can't keep it with him, so he has to give it to the temple. But Elamand Amar B'Shenech Machzer Asurin Vol Mahader, but in the case where he says where the Nechse Machzer are Asurin, but in the case where he says where Shimon is not allowed to return it to Reuven, and so therefore Reuven wouldn't have to pay Shimon the money in the first place because Shimon's not returning to him. Well, if that's the case, it's Malcolm. So what's the scenario where it's a place where Reuven would have to pay Shimon? Shimon's never allowed to return it to him. So Gemara says, indeed, this is a kasha. This is indeed a difficulty. Shimon's never allowed to return to him. So what's the scenario that we're talking about where Shimon has returned it to him? So Gemara says, indeed, this is a difficulty according to that approach, according to the second, the Ikedemasni. So now, or Ikedemasni of Eilashna. So now, on the top of Lamadal and Amabeis, 34b, Gemara brings in what seems an unrelated concept, but it connects, at least on a conceptual level, to the next Gemara. So we have a statement of Rava on Rava 30 that Rava teaches us. Let's say a person has in front of him a loaf of bread. Now the loaf of bread is not owned by anybody; it's hefker, and it's teaching us this. The Mefarish says it's a rabusa, it's a chiddush that even if he doesn't own it, but for sure if he does own it, then he could do what the scenario that we're talking about. So he has in front of him a loaf of bread. The loaf of bread is ownerless, and he says kikar v'amar kikar zu hekdesh, and he says this loaf of bread is going to be considered hekdesh. He's consecrating it, meaning to say he wants to be zocha. He wants to acquire this piece of property on behalf of hekdesh. And it's a takana of the chachamim that a person can acquire an object that's within his 4 amos without actually doing a kinyan. That's from Bava Metzia. And so therefore he's allowed to be makdish, consecrate this object that's found within 4 amos of him. And it's as though he picks it up. And he says, Kikar zu hektish. So then, ocha. So now that this object is hektish, if he picks it up in order to eat it, ocha. If he picks it up in order to eat it, then we're going to say that he has trespassed. He's misappropriated temple property because this is the temple's loaf of bread. Once he declares it hektish, and he's misappropriated the entire loaf, because when he picks up the loaf of bread, he's taking it out of the domain of the hektish into his own domain, and therefore he has to pay to hektish the value of the loaf of bread plus 1/5. But if he doesn't have in mind to acquire the loaf of bread, but rather all he has in mind is Risha Levanav, he only has in mind to bequeath it to his children. He says, this loaf of bread will be for my children, meaning to say he doesn't intend to acquire for himself. And also his children are not acquiring it as long as he's alive, because he's basically only picking it up in order to leave it to them after his death. And so they're not getting it now. And so therefore, if nobody's acquiring it right now, it's not actually me'ilah. He's not misappropriating the loaf of bread. So therefore, that's the way the Ron explains it. So therefore, under these circumstances, how is he misappropriated? He hasn't misappropriated with the loaf of bread. Malafi tova sanashaba. He's only misappropriated according to the benefit that he's acquired as a result of this. What is it? He's got the benefit that his children think he's a great guy because he wants to give them this loaf of bread after he dies. And so therefore he's misappropriated that value, the value of people thinking you're a great guy. And so therefore, even though he has, under this circumstance, that's the me'ilah that he has to pay. The value of this tovas hana, he has to pay that amount plus an extra 1/5. So now the Gemara says, let's talk about a case similar to Rava. So the Gemara says, what about the following case? So Rav Chia bar Avin turns to Rava and he says, "By mine Rav Chia bar Avin mi Rava." Rav Chia bar Avin asked a similar question to Rava, and he says as follows: Kikari alecha. He says, if my loaf of bread is prohibited upon you, Kikari alecha, my loaf of bread is prohibited upon you. And then afterwards, Nisana lo b'matana, and afterwards he says, my loaf of bread is prohibited upon you. And afterwards, he gives this person to Reuven, says to Shimon, my loaf of bread right here, you're not allowed to benefit from my loaf of bread. And then afterwards, Reuven gives it to Shimon as a gift. Reuven gives it to Shimon as a gift. So, ki karyolecha, unesana lo b'matana, and then he gives it to him as a gift. Ma'u, what's going to be the law there under these circumstances? Do we say Kikari Amarlo? Did he say my loaf is prohibited to you? And so therefore, Ki Isa Birushu Seuda Asarlo. So therefore, when the loaf is in Reuven's possession, that's when it's prohibited to Shimon. O Dilma, or what he's really saying is Alecha Amarle. Or maybe he's saying what's upon you is prohibited. Ilave Shavise Hektish, that upon you, this is considered to be like hektish, like it's consecrated. Therefore, you can't have any benefit from this loaf. Is the emphasis on this is my loaf, and as long as it's my loaf, you can't have benefit. So therefore, once Reuven gives it as a gift, Shimon could have benefit. Or is the emphasis on the loaf? The loaf is prohibited to you. So irrespective of it's mine, or if I gave it to you as a gift, you can't have benefit. So what's the answer? That's what Rav Chia bar Avin turns to Rava. So the Gemara says, Amarle, that Rava responds, Pshita, it's obvious, the afagav. It's so obvious, the afagav. Diyahivle b'matana asar. So it's obvious in that case that even though he gave him the loaf of bread as a gift, it's going to be prohibited, because the whole point is that the loaf is prohibited, not the mine is prohibited. And so therefore it's going to be prohibited. So Rav Chia comes back and says, no, here's what I was asking. If what you're saying is that the loaf of bread is prohibited, even though Shimon has received it as a gift, it's going to be prohibited because Alecha is the point. So this is what I was asking. Ela kikari Alecha lafuke mai. Why does he say my loaf? He should have just said the loaf. The loaf is prohibited upon you. Why does it say my loaf is prohibited on you? Aren't we trying to exclude the following case? Kikari alecha lafuke mai. Aren't we trying to exclude the following case? Lav lafuke. Aren't we trying to exclude a case di ganva mine mignav? That let's say that if the person who's not allowed to have benefit, i.e. Shimon, somehow steals the loaf of bread from Reuven, then it will be permitted. Because under those circumstances, then it's no longer in the possession of Reuven. And so therefore, Shimon will be allowed to get benefit from it. Of course, Shimon would have to pay back Reuven for the loaf of bread that he stole, but this loaf of bread will be permitted because it's no longer Reuven's loaf. But So if that's the case, that we're allowing it because it's no longer in his possession, we should also allow it if it's stolen. We should also allow it if it's given as a gift. So the Gemara says no. When he says kikari, what's it coming to exclude? No, that's not what he's coming to exclude. He's not coming to exclude that case. And just read the Mefarish. Fuketi ganva migna. We're also kikar. If he steals that loaf of bread, the nasnalo agan of the matana. So let's say, well, what are we talking about? The Mefarish explains, not like I explained it, but explains it differently. He says if somebody stole that loaf of bread and the Ganav gave it as a matana, as a gift to, let's say, Shimon, she'eno asar, then Shimon is not going to be prohibited. Why? Because Reuven himself did not give it directly. Or do we say Dilma afagav digan mignav asirle, or do we say even though it was stolen from him, it remains prohibited to ruling? That's the question. So therefore, if it's going to be permitted, if somebody else stole it, it should also be permitted if it's given as a gift. So therefore, Rava responds, no, the one who takes the oath, when it says kikari, it's not excluding the case where it was stolen. There, it would remain prohibited. It's referring to a case where Reuven, whose loaf of bread it was, invited Shimon over to his house. If he invited him over to his house to eat the loaf of bread with him, and it was placed before them on the table, and he says, Ki kari alecha, under these circumstances, we're saying that the other loaves of bread in the house are permitted to eat, because since he didn't say kikar, it means to say that the other loaves are permitted, but this loaf of bread is going to be prohibited even if he's going to accept it as a gift. So that's what we're referring to. So the Ran says, I might have said the because at that moment it's still going to be considered to be the owner of the house's gift. And the Mefar says, he invited him over to his house, and then he says, and then afterwards he says, my loaf is prohibited upon you. Under that circumstance, even the Ismail, since he invited him over to his house, Kana Chalko, he already acquired his portion, Kamashu like that he's able to eat. But the lav kule denotes in who elagam the mezuman. So the Mefarish is saying a little differently from the Ran, saying under those circumstances, once you invited him over to your house, then you can no longer prohibit the loaf of bread upon him, because at that moment it becomes the person who was invited over. It becomes that's what the Mefarish seems to be saying. That once you invite him over, you can't prohibit the loaf of bread upon him because it's already become that person's loaf, that person's possession. So this relates to a law in the Ramah that, let's say you invite somebody over to your house and you serve food on the table, and then the person takes the food and he wants to betroth the woman who's sitting next to him with that food. So whose food is it? The Ramah says that she is Mekudeshes, that she's betrothed. That seems to be like it's the guest's food. That seems to be inconsistent with this Ran, but he is consistent or more consistent with the Mefarish. Okay, let's stop here. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address the questions.